Well, hello and welcome to Photography with Imre, and that would be me. And today I kind of let loose with my wild side at the Calgary Zoo to do this episode on HDR photography, high dynamic range photography that is. This is actually a viewer request. 2 viewers requested this, and I certainly hope that you enjoy it. Let's get started. High Dynamic Range Imaging, or HDRI, provides the ability to represent a greater tonal range in a single image by combining multiple photographs taken with different exposure settings. If you're not quite sure what that means, let's take a look at this example. In this first shot, I exposed for the sky, and in the second shot on the right, I exposed for the land. The element in the scene I exposed for in each shot looks good, but I can't adequately capture the tones from either portion in one shot. Either the land is too dark, or the sky is blown out. But if I use HDR photography, then I can combine several shots to create a single one that better represents the scene as it was. Unlike our wonderfully adaptive human eyes that can see quite a bit of detail in both light and dark areas of a scene at the same time, the sensor of a digital camera does little more than to basically collect photons into buckets called photosites. Let's take a look at this simplified diagram to see why a sensor cannot expose both light and dark areas more evenly. If we expose for the sky, the shutter speed will hopefully be short enough to not blow bright areas like the clouds. As you can see here, a photosite that happens to capture a bright portion of the image fills almost completely, but the bucket that happens to capture a dark area is almost empty. Because of the short shutter speed, those buckets on which less light fell didn't have enough time to capture a sufficient amount of light. Thus, you get an underexposed landscape with little detail. Now if we expose for the land, then the shutter will stay open longer to allow more light through to the sensor. But as you can see in this case, the photosite that happens to capture a bright portion of the image becomes saturated with light, filling completely, whereas a photosite corresponding to the darker area now fills to just about the right level. So here we get a very bright and almost completely white sky. Alright, so we have a basic idea of what's wrong, but how can we create an HDR photo? Well, let's go on location to find out. Alright, so I managed to find a nice and peaceful spot here. It's incredibly busy at the zoo today, and I guess I'll kind of go through the steps of taking an HDR photograph. So one of the first things that you need to keep in mind is that you are taking multiple exposures, which you are going to be combining later. And one of the things that may be helpful is a tripod. Now, I'm not going to carry a tripod with me today because I'm already carrying enough stuff, so in my case, I'm going to rely on Adobe Photoshop's ability to align the images when I basically import them into the program. Now what you can do is, with your camera, you can do auto exposure bracketing, which is what I'm doing today because it makes my life a little bit easier. Plus I don't have the tripod, so if I take the camera away from my eyes, and to do any changes to the exposure, I may not frame it exactly the same way again. Therefore, I'm just relying on my camera's high speed feature and bracketing, and I'm taking 5 shots that are separated by basically one exposure value, so essentially an f-stop apart. So that's -2 f-stops, -1, and the actual exposure, +1, and then +2 exposure values. So I'm getting an underexposure and an overexposure. It seems to be working half decent today. It's not really bright. There's some clouds in the sky, so it should be working all right. Before moving on, I also want to recommend that only the shutter speed is changed to over and underexpose the shots. Changing the sensitivity could introduce noise into the photos, especially increasing it, and if the aperture size is manipulated, then depth of field could impact the images, which will leave you with photos that don't quite look the same. Check out my blog for more details too. So at this point, once I frame up my shot, all I pretty much do is hold down the shutter button. I hear my camera take 5 quick exposures, takes about a second for it to do it, and at that point I'm basically done. Now one of the pitfalls is that anything that moves in the picture, it won't really work. So if it's a really windy day, if you have people crossing the scene, if you have water that's flowing, you may get a little bit of blurring or some very unusual artifacts. So HDR works well with things that are still, because you do require more than one exposure. So that's something to keep in mind. But other than that, it works half decent, and definitely we'll see what some of these outcomes are. I took a picture of the scene behind me and several others here, and let's take a look and see what they turned out like. I'll start with the photos I took in the park where I shot the previous video clips. By the way, originally I took 5 photos of each scene, but I'm showing 3 as space is a tad limited on screen. The images on the left and right are the 2 extremes, under and overexposure respectively, and the photo in the middle is more or less the normal exposure. None of these images quite does the scene justice, as the exposure is overall too dark or the highlights are blown. But with some HDR processing, the clouds look great and there's a more even tonality to the foliage. Next up is a great example of how the scene would be almost impossible to capture in one exposure. The gazebo is very dark inside and the sky is really bright, along with the park just beyond and to the right. Again, the HDR image has a greater tonal range and details pop out from the gazebo and the well-lit areas. I think I could have captured another even more overexposed shot to further enhance the shadow areas, but nonetheless a good example. And lastly, here's an indoor shot. The windows and sunlit pathway produces a stark contrast to the shadowed area on the right. The exposure in the middle almost passes, but the color is washed out on the bright pathway, and even with some enhancement in the shadow areas, there would likely be more noise revealed than detail. But again, the HDR image demonstrates how such scenes can be improved. And before concluding this episode, let's examine some of the pros and cons of HDR photography, starting with the former. For the first point, it's quite obvious that a greater tonal range can be represented in an image, therefore preserving more detail compared to a single exposure. If well manipulated, the resulting HDR photo can look quite pleasing to the eye, as to some extent the image will correspond to what we can see in reality. In addition, HDR can open up some creative path for those who are more daring to experiment. On the downside though, processing HDR images usually takes somewhat longer than working with a single exposure, and poorly manipulated shots can look very unusual and even fake. You'll also be limited to what you can shoot, since you need more than one exposure to create an HDR photo. So if the wind is blowing trees and fueling waves, traffic is moving on the streets, or people and animals are in motion, then you're out of luck, unless you really like strange looking results. And although this last point I'll make could also be a pro, a tripod may be necessary to ensure identical shots, unless you don't mind waiting the few extra seconds for Photoshop to line up the exposures. Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode on HDR photography, and as usual, I'll be writing a blog post, so do check that out. And this is only part 1, of course. Part 2 will have how I go through and edit the photos in Photoshop. And of course, there's Facebook and Twitter links off of my blog, and do subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks, and I hope to see you next time. Take care. So, hope to see you next time. Take care. Ooh. And that'll make it to the blooper reel, because that's what happens when you shoot in public and you have lots of kids running around. It's quite amusing. Anyway, let's take whatever.